Last week, the team at Neowiz very graciously flew me out along with a few other creators and media to a private preview event where, along with a bunch of other activities, we were allowed to play new content from the Lies of P DLC for 2 whole hours. I've been waiting on this since then, but I can finally share my experience with you guys, and I gotta say, I can't wait for the DLC. The short preview reminded me what it is I love so much about the Lies of P world, and it was filled with discovery, excitement, and challenge. We've all been waiting for the DLC, and now we finally have some news about the DLC titled Overture. Before we get into the video and the gameplay footage, I'd like to mention that out of the 2 hours, we were only allowed to record 1 hour of our playthrough, going through one of the initial DLC areas, so you'll be seeing the first major area along with the one mini-boss. There will be new enemies, elites, weapons, and consumables. If you consider these major spoilers, I would recommend avoiding watching this video. However, I've tried my best to not touch on any major bosses or story points. I did manage to fight 3 other major bosses in a separate session, however, we weren't allowed to record our gameplay for that sequence, so I'll not mention anything about those fights to save the experience for you guys when you get around to playing it yourselves. On to the event itself. 2 hours may sound like a lot for a DLC, though I'm very excited to tell you guys that we barely managed to scratch the surface. What was confirmed to us about the DLC was that it would be priced at $30 and would come out with a free base game patch as well. The base game patch is mostly intended to introduce the new difficulty tiers to the game. That's right, Lies of P is going to have 3 difficulty modes once the DLC drops. The default difficulty mode is called Legendary Stalker and will be the same as what we played the base game on. But for those of you that struggle with Lies of P and mostly wanted to get through the story, there will be 2 more easier modes called Butterfly's Guidance and Awakened Puppet. I personally think this is a really cool idea to make the game more accessible to wider audiences. I consider myself decent when it comes to Souls games, and I struggled a lot with some of the bosses in Lies of P, so anything to make the experience more welcoming is a positive thing in my opinion. They will also be adding 2 boss rush modes. This is what the other 1 hour session consisted of that we weren't allowed to record. During the session we played 3 new DLC bosses, and I personally really enjoyed the fights and the mechanics, but I won't talk about them in greater detail so that I can save you guys the experience. What I will say is that the boss rush mode was really cool. Each boss can be fought in 5 stages ranging from 1 to 5 in increasing difficulty. I managed to beat the 3 new DLC bosses up to stage 3 and nearly beat one of them on stage 4, however we just didn't have enough time to play more. I did notice that boss HP and damage went up from 1 to 5, however I wasn't able to check whether the bosses get new moves when you progress to a higher stage. I asked about this to director Choi Jae-won and he said, "There's a secret," and laughed but wouldn't tell me more, so I'm assuming there's gonna be something new when you get to stage 5. What we didn't manage to get was a release date. However, it did seem like the build that we played on was very close to being ready for release, so I wouldn't be surprised to get a release date within the next month. Onwards to the footage, most of what you will see here will be my gameplay, along with a few clips that they provided us with. We begin the journey in the snow-covered location called Strange Forest. They popped me in here directly, so I didn't get to see how or when you get here, but I do have some speculations about it. Since we only had 1 hour, I immediately started moving along the forest, and I noticed something a little unusual. For the first time in Krat, we don't see puppets or humanoid carcasses, but we see animals turned into carcasses from the petrification disease. We do see the occasional petrified dog here and there in the base game, but this probably has some huge lore implications for the DLC. I didn't stop to look around too much since I was on a timer. Here's where you see one of the new weapons in the DLC, the Pale Knight. This is a really cool gunblade of sorts that lets you gain distance and then gap close with the follow-up. The gunshot Fable art packs a serious punch, and I really enjoyed using this weapon and wouldn't be surprised to see it become a quick favorite. I get introduced to this new Wolverine-type enemy that launches itself at you. Keep in mind that the Neowiz devs set up our accounts with really high stats and armor, so we're pretty kitted out for this point in the game. However, the enemies still felt challenging and scaled appropriately, so going into the DLC unprepared might be a little problematic. There's also this bear-like creature with a helm with spikes inserted into its head, as if the petrification wasn't gruesome enough. This guy was a little bit harder, but these enemies make a lot of thematic sense to the legacy dungeon we're approaching. During this battle, you've also hopefully noticed I get afflicted by a brand new status, Freeze. This is a rather punishing status that continuously drains your HP and also slows your attack and movement speed. They do give you anti-freeze ampules to deal with this, but I had some issues with this later on with a specific enemy, so do beware. I'm using the Maniac's Pinwheel Blade because I just thought it looked super cool. This weapon primarily scaled on motivity, which is Lies of P terminology for strength. This weapon is really cool and works kind of like the pizza cutter from Elden Ring, except the pinwheels start rotating when you move or attack, and once it gets going, every attack becomes a multi-hit, which is super cool. I'm also using a brand new Legion arm called the Cataclysm arm. This arm kind of works like a shotgun. You charge it up and then release for a big burst of damage. There were a few other new weapons as well that I'll showcase later on. As we move deeper into the forest, I find a note talking about Krot Zoo, which leads us to our first major legacy dungeon.
It's an ad for Krot Zoo? How is that still here? Wait. Something's not right. Is that? Yes, it is. That's Krot Zoo. How in the blazes? And I mean that literally. The zoo burned down a long time ago. Just give me a minute to think about this.
As Gemini mentions, we're heading into Krot Zoo, but we can speculate a little bit about the DLC's timeline based on what he tells us. He sounds surprised to see the zoo because it supposedly burnt down a long time ago. We're either reliving the memories of Carlo from when he was alive and wasn't a puppet, or we actually get transported into the past. I'm still unsure where exactly this happens in the base game, but in an interview with the director, he did mention that it will be accessible after Chapter 9 of the base game, so it's quite a ways in. As I get closer to the zoo, I find another new enemy type, this monkey ape type enemy. This guy attacks really quick, but my heavy attacks were able to stagger him, so I didn't struggle too bad. Here, I also use the Icarus Legion arm, which shoots out razor blades. This seems to be similar to the Saw Blade's throwable item, but at its higher levels, I think it's gonna do a lot of DPS. Once I enter the zoo, I'm greeted by a voice that introduces herself as Marchiona, the Puppeteer of Death. I actually fought Marchiona in the unrecorded footage, and she's really cool, but don't worry, I won't talk about her anymore. Here, I shortly switch to one of the other weapons. This is a really cool lance weapon that also functions as a flamethrower. It's really cool as a way to inflict statuses which are really strong against carcasses and Lies of P. There's also an acidic variant that you can use against humans called the Silent Evangelist's Macehead. I fight my first elite here, who's this huge elephant hybrid with a very weak lower half that it drags across the floor. This guy actually manages to kill me, but I return the favor shortly after. The lance has a Fable buff that makes it stronger, and its greater Fable ability is a powerful thrust that deals a lot of damage. Another cool addition to the DLC is the secondary bow weapon called the Royal Hornbow. It didn't seem to do crazy amounts of damage, but it was fun to play with the short bit I tried, and there's some really fancy plays you can make with it. I'm definitely going to try to optimize for a bow build on one of my playthroughs of the DLC. I'll talk more about it later. There's also the Death's Talon's Claws. These are technique weapons, which is Lies of P speak for dex. The claws are really fast and cool to play with, however you might find you're lacking in damage. The Rampage Fable Art fixes this as it buffs the damage on the claws by a lot for a short period of time. The backstab animation is also sick, so I'll definitely be using these more. I pick up this new item called the Ancient Disc, which seems to be a currency of some type for a new merchant, similar to the gold coin fruit from the base game. The description is very interesting, and I can't wait to get more information about how you'd interact with this. A bit further down, I fight these kangaroo enemies who are absolutely hilarious. Kangaroos have a reputation for being great boxers, but these guys just hopped all over me. The bow is really cool here, and the Fablard actually does some insane stun damage. There's also a dodge shot Fablard that lets you back up and get away from danger while doing some damage. Another new addition to the DLC are brand new consumables. They seem to have really added ways to help the player find ways to be tankier or heal. The Miraculous Enhancement Ampule is one such consumable that buffs your max HP, stamina, and Legionnaire meter all at once. Right after this sequence, I meet the bane of my existence. It's the elephant carcass from earlier, except he's insane. I spent like 10 to 15 minutes of my 1-hour session dying to this guy over and over again. He has a phase 2 where he surrounds the area with frost, and it absolutely destroyed me. It was honestly getting a little embarrassing, but I managed to get past him somehow, though it did require throwing all my throwables, including the kitchen sink at him. I find a little bit more information about Marchiona from this flyer. It seems she too was related to the Order of the Alchemists, which, if you remember from the base game, was Simon Manus' organization that pursued immortality through Ergo, of which Victor and Lexasia were a few of their experiments. Finally, just a little bit later, I encountered the mini-boss of the area, the Tyrannical Predator, an enormous crocodile. This guy was hard. He reminded me a lot of the hippo from Shadow of the Erdtree, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was a major inspiration. The long winding bite grab attack was nearly 1-to-1, including how hard it was to time to dodge. I died once to him and I had like 5 minutes left of my session, and I didn't think I was going to be able to beat him, but I adjusted my inventory and equipped a few throwables and went at him again. That was pretty close, but this is where our gameplay session unfortunately ended. This was an incredible reintroduction to Krot and the beautiful world that Neowiz and Round8 have created, and I honestly just wish it was out already because it was so much fun to just get back into the game. I hope you guys enjoyed this little sneak peek into the DLC and are just as excited as I am for Overture. Hopefully we get a date soon. Thanks again to the wonderful folks over at Neowiz and Round8 for inviting me to the preview, and I hope you all enjoyed the video.